Welcome, everyone, to the Ecopsychology Café. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel, and I'm the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network, the host of this series. Monica Dragoza and I co-created this program. Today, we're going to hear from Natalie Thomas about internal family systems and climate emotions. But before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that I live in the traditional territory of the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people under the treaties of peace and friendship. I offer gratitude to the Indigenous peoples who live here now and who have lived here for thousands of years for the legacy of caring for the land, water, fire, and air. I acknowledge the many creatures and living beings whose habitat was here and is here today. I acknowledge the ongoing impacts of colonization and systemic oppression of the people and the land on which we reside. Today, as we discuss the importance of internal family systems, I invite all of us to uncolonize our work to embrace wider systems of care and concern. And now about our presenter. Natalie Thomas is a professor and therapist with a background in environmental and animal ethics philosophy. As a climate-aware therapist and regional coordinator with the Climate Psychology Alliance North America for the province of Ontario, she is actively researching and developing approaches for supporting clients and people as they increasingly experience distress related to climate change. Natalie also holds monthly climate cafes online for anyone in Canada and more local events in Guelph, Ontario, along with climate cafe facilitation trainings online. Welcome, Natalie. Thank you so much for sharing your time and wisdom with us. And I'll turn the airwaves over to you.
Thank you so much. That's a really lovely welcome. And Monica, for the grounding, I really appreciate that. So I'm just going to share my slides. I'm going to do that first just to make sure I'm all set up. There we go. It takes a minute, and just trying to get my little on chat. There we go. I just want to get my chat open as well, so I'll leave that open. So yeah, so thank you so much for this. I think I do, I don't know, I like to be busy. I have a lot of energy apparently as I'm listening to the introduction. I'm like, I like doing lots of different things. And just wanted to say that coming to therapy a little bit later. So I've worked as a professor for a long time. And my background in philosophy, I focused on environmental philosophy and ethics and animal ethics and animal philosophy, if anyone's familiar with those. So this is partly what led me into this area. And then it was my own love for internal family systems that then led me back to school to train as a therapist. So this is sort of a bit of a newer thing for me, but now I feel excited to kind of bring my worlds together in this way. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about what I'm working with and what I'm thinking about in terms of internal family systems and maybe how it can be helpful with all the different climate emotions that people are experiencing. And I know there have been articles coming out, so increasing number of articles in media talking about climate and eco-anxiety. I tend to think more about climate distress and climate emotions. So this, if you're familiar with this from the Climate Mental Health Network, I just think is such a really handy climate emotions wheel. I think there are more than this, but I do think this is a really great way of kind of easing into thinking about what emotions people are having in relation to the climate crisis and what we're experiencing all over the world. So I see, we're across Canada. I see someone from the UK. So these emotions are showing up, I think, more often. And when I do consultations with people, this will come up, right? They'll talk about just their overwhelming anxiety at the state of the world in general, but often will bring up something related to climate. So just interesting, and I just invite you to kind of look at this circle and think which ones might be the ones that come up for you, or the ones that are most present, or the ones maybe you tend to notice most often. Mine's cycle, I've noticed a little bit. This winter in Ontario, where I am, we really didn't have a winter. We had maybe 2 snowfalls, which is really shocking, really shocking. And I noticed my emotions were more in the sadness. I felt this real, like, a pining for winter, and and fear of, is this, what our winters will become in the future. So a lot of mixes, but I think it's important even for IFS to start, really, it's just starting to notice what are some of the emotions that come up for me. And so I use this wheel fairly often now, even in climate cafes, to help people identify, like, what are the emotions that you're feeling as we, come into this climate cafe and talk about these emotions. So just to kind of, if it's helpful for you to look at this and think, are any of them present now as we start into this talk? I think it can be helpful to notice this. Yeah, okay, so some anger and positivity. Yeah. Um, Anger, and I often notice frustration will come up closely related to anger, which often makes sense, but thank you for sharing that. And sadness. Yeah. Thank you for sharing those in the chat. Powerlessness. Yes. So that is one that I will speak a little bit more to in relation to IFS. Guilt. Yeah, that one comes up. I notice that one comes up a lot, especially with younger. I notice in younger generations, there's a lot of guilt about, there's anger, frustration, and guilt that shows up a lot in university students. Yeah, and guilt and hope and outrage. Yeah, all over the wheel. Yeah, yeah. I feel you. I'm all over the wheel too, very often. Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing that. I appreciate you thinking about that. So I think many of us are probably familiar with some of what we're talking about when we talk about climate distress, but I wanted to kind of just spend a minute saying that there's a few things I think are important to remember. And one is that any kind of distress over climate, whether it's anxiety or any of the emotions you've just identified, are, in my mind, they're understandable and normal, like they're normal responses to what's happening. And so I think that's important to name that. And I think what also strikes me as something that is unique about the climate crisis is that we often feel these emotions in relation to immediate changes and threats. Here, my mind is already starting to go to the wildfires this summer, and starting to anticipate them. So there's an immediate kind of threat to this, but there's also the existential threat, which is that larger kind of more vague fear, right, and anxiety. So that to me also makes climate emotions or distress a bit more unique than some other things we see as therapists. The other thing I think is interesting is that I've also noticed with a lot of people I work with kind of when climate comes into the therapy room, is that it can also bring up either PTSD related to experiencing a climate emergency or disaster, but also previous trauma that a person may have experienced. So when someone mentioned the powerlessness, right, I think it might come a little bit from there. That can be, if you've experienced powerlessness in relation to maybe earlier or more complex trauma, that can also be brought up again with climate, different types of climate emotions. So this is something that I see, and I think so it can trigger pre-existing vulnerabilities. Also, when someone experiences this, I should say, ongoing without break. So I've also worked with people that are activists to the point of utter burnout and exhaustion. And over time, I think it can compound. to into maybe like, so it's like sometimes I think of it with grief. We can experience grief where there is sadness over time. Sometimes it can deepen into a deeper depression, right, or deeper anxieties, or PTSD, even depending on the nature of the grief. And so I see something similar with this too, that over time, if it's unrelenting and there's no break, it can deepen into something else. So that's kind of just touching a little bit on what I see as sort of the climate emotions. And then what I started to notice with internal family system. So if I just say IFS, that's what I'm referring to. And this is a diagram that's available on the IFS Institute website, but I think it's handy for giving you a quick glimpse, if you're not familiar with IFS, of kind of the system, our system as it's conceived of. And when we say burdened internal system, right, not all of our parts might be carrying, internal parts of us might be carrying burdens, and some are, right? And so the managers and firefighters are part of our protective system, and our exiles are part of the more vulnerable, painful ones, parts that exist in us that have been maybe pushed away or outside of our system. And that's why the word exile is used, even though I don't love the word exile. I like to refer to them more as the painful parts. And then self energy in the middle, right, which is considered to be the source of healing for all of the different parts that we have. And I've started to kind of see that. So for some people, the managers might come in when we're talking about climate change, and they might numb a person. They might deny climate change. They might be overly logical and analytic and constantly, searching through the facts and trying to focus on that. Or the firefighters, of course, are usually come in stronger. So the firefighters jump in if the managers can't succeed in protecting the exiled parts. So firefighters tend to be, I call them a little bit more dramatic, but they're just more extreme. So, these ones might be, and typically are, substance abuse, disordered eating, dissociating, self-harm, all the way to suicidal parts, and so, I'm trying to give you a bit of a brief picture here. The exiled parts or the painful parts also, not always, often they are younger parts of us, and usually then are the parts that protect them. So when I mentioned before that sometimes climate distress can bring up or activate some of the exiles or the more painful parts from our past, which also means that a lot of our managers are really active, and protective parts are really active in trying to keep the pain away, right, in whatever form that is. And so even something like, activism at the point where you can't stop, it's so urgent and you can't stop going, even if you're hurting yourself, is sort of a protective part that has moved into a firefighter role. It won't relent, and it thinks it's protecting you because it's trying to keep you away from the pain of the exile and protect you from these threats that it perceives, right? So this is a very quick, and I apologize for giving a really quick overview, but I want to make sure I get through some of the key points of this. But the self energy I wanted to look at for a minute too, because there's generally thought to be these 8 characteristics of self. And these characteristics, basically our self is the source of healing for all of our parts. It's also able to, when we have more self energy and we are less blended with the parts, we are better able, for example, as an activist, let's say, to focus our anger or the emotions we're having, to say, okay, when I'm 90% anger and 10% self, I'm not very effective, right? I am just in a rage. But if I'm, 70% self and 20% anger, I can direct, let's say, if it's related to, a justice issue, or it's, an injustice or something that we feel anger about, I'm able to kind of work with that, and kind of focus it. That's partly the way I see it. Partly also, self energy is what provides us with a feeling of compassion for our own parts that are suffering and related to climate crisis, and for the parts of others. So when we're working, if you do work as an IFS therapist or you're interested in it, the compassion is what we're hoping for. That a person will be able to start to feel compassion towards their parts, rather than a feeling of, I wish this would just stop and go away. I don't want to feel this anymore. It's more about, can we be curious about the part and get to know it a little bit, and why it's doing this? Why, what beliefs does it have? Why does it feel that it needs to do this in your system? And as more of the compassion comes in, there's more kind of unblending of the parts. And this is really the key, right? For IFS in general, but also with climate distress, is two things. We find a trailhead. So when I asked you what's most present right now, when you think about the climate crisis, I might say right now, for me, it would be, I can notice, for example, I have anxiety about, will we get enough rain in the next little while to prevent drought and fires in this area? That might be my trailhead today, where then I follow it to see which part is holding this anxiety and this fear. And then we start to work to really get to know that part. And so this unblending is that, rather than feeling like I am anxious, I am the one that's full of this anxiety, I start to notice that it's a part of me that's holding this anxiety. And can I just almost bring it out from me a little bit, and then get to relate to it from myself energy, rather than being fully blended with the part, so that all I can feel is the anxiety. And really, that's the magic, believe it or not. The magic is the little bit of unblending and the compassion for the part that holds this anxiety. And so this is where, IFS is really interesting, because as we get to know the different parts of ourselves, we can start to see, aha, like, this anxiety might be protecting a part of me that has a deeper vulnerability about something. And then it can lead to kind of the gentle unblending, and more of like an integration of the parts. So really, the getting to know the parts, hearing what they have to say, and being open to hearing what they have to say, rather than, we often might say something, generally like, oh, here's this self-critical part that tells me I'm not doing enough to help. I'm not enough of an activist. And we might be tempted to say, oh, there's that self-critical part, we need to push it away and tell it to be quiet. And this is sort of the opposite of saying, let's invite it in for a conversation and get to know it better. So this is partly what we're doing. It follows generally the 6 F's, which, in a process of getting to know our parts, we sort of find the part. So as I mentioned, it might be, what am I feeling most right now? And where do I notice it? Usually anxiety or fear, I tend to feel in my chest. So I might kind of think, okay, this is what I'm feeling right now. And then we focus on it, really put our attention on it, rather than looking in another direction. Fleshing it out, again, I'm not 100% in love with all the terms, but the idea of really getting to know, describe it. What does it look like for you? Does it sound like a particular voice? What is it like? What is it willing to show you? And then noticing how you feel towards the part. So again, in IFS, we're looking for curiosity and compassion. If someone says, I really don't like this part, or it freaks me out, then usually that's another part that feels that way. Self energy, you will notice it will match with one of those 8 characteristics usually, but curiosity and compassion are the ones we're generally looking for. And then just curiosity, befriending it, getting to be a little bit more comfortable with it. And this might take, this might work in one session. It might be multiple sessions, because some parts have been around for so long that they're very firm in what they do, and they need to build a sense of trust that you're not trying to get rid of them. You actually just want to get to know them. And then you're also looking at what the part fears, and this is really enlightening. If you ask a part, what are you worried about, or what are you scared of? What are you scared, or fearful of in terms of what might happen if you're not feeling anxious? So, right, like what is your fear? If you're not feeling this anxiety all the time, then what are you scared of? And you're trying to really get to understand what the role is of that part. So these are sort of the classic IFS 6 Fs. I would say, again, I've mentioned this before, you just want to be a little bit careful. Like with any work, I would say, being trauma informed or trauma sensitive, where it's gentle into the system, right, of somebody with curiosity, rather than telling a part what to do, or that it needs to leave, or that it has to stop. It's more about this really gentle easing into the system of yourself and of someone else. And it will know, it has a wisdom that's kind of shocking in sessions, that it will know what it needs. It's really always, to me, quite mind-blowing when you will talk to a person's part and the part will say, this is what I need from you right now. And you're like, well, there you go. And that's just what we follow, right, in the moment. So again, curiosity and compassion and kind of being in self energy. So parts mapping can be helpful, and parts mapping is a way of, I realize now, I might send this out. I'll just give you one little example. This is online. It's a little diagram called the inner conference table. So if I sit down and think which parts of me are present right now, I might start writing, yeah, I have an anxious part, I have an angry part, and then I'll start to get to know them. And this is often what I do with a client. If it feels like there's all kinds of parts coming up, then we just look at which ones of these are impacted right now by the news, the latest climate news, or whatever that might be, and spend some time mapping, which is really getting to know a person's system. And over time, it deepens the relationship with the parts. So mapping can be helpful. The only thing two things on here that I would point out sometimes, so there is an unburdening process in IFS with the exiles. It's, I would say now, there's mixed feelings about this, but again, being trauma informed, you want to be careful about unburdening if you don't have some training in this, or if you're not really trained in trauma work. I would say to be a little bit careful around it, because a lot of exiles, you're pulling up a memory usually of trauma, and the person can very much get pulled into that. And so you just want to be aware of kind of the unburdening process. However, most work, the vast majority of IFS, is getting to know and witness our protectors anyway. And that brings a lot of relief to a person's system. So I say that just as kind of a little thing that might be something you would want to learn a little bit more about. Also, recognizing that our parts get activated. It's, kind of a transference, countertransference. In IFS, we talk about there can be parts of a client that activate our parts. And I find in IFS, there's a lot more emphasis on us doing our own work with this, so that we can hold our own self energy while we're sitting with a client. Right. So some clients can't access their own self energy, in which case, if we have access to ours, we hold it for ourselves and for them in the session until they're able, right, to build that self energy. So I do find that for me, I mean, I also, like, I regularly see my own IFS therapist, and I notice the parts of me that get activated along the way. And if I work with clients, I'm like, aha, there's this part that came up. And I keep working on that. It doesn't mean it's perfect, but the idea, even in IFS trainings, they spend a lot of time saying, what are you noticing in yourself right now? What parts are up? Can you connect with your self energy and keep going? So that's a part, a kind of an aspect of this that I find quite lovely, but also important, I think, to keep in mind. And this kind of explains what I've been saying. I tried to summarize it, but really you combine it. I combine this with other distress tolerance if a person is in real distress. So DBT skills or self-regulation skills can be helpful as well if a person is in a lot of distress. But the idea, the real goal here is so you're increasing self-energy in yourself and the client, and then you're building a relationship with the parts of the client and their own self, as they relate, in this case, to what's happening in the world and with climate. So I'm going to skip over this kind of quickly, but hopefully I've explained it before, because I wanted to get to this, which is other ways of connecting IFS I'm starting to see with ecotherapy and ecopsychology is that often in IFS circles, there is this talk about how your self-energy is just naturally increased when you're in nature. There's, and I've been mulling this over, the philosophical part of me is like, why is this? And I tend to think a little bit, if anyone's familiar with deep ecology, which is, what I studied for a long time and is starting to come back to me now. In deep ecology, they talk about self-identification with nature and self-realization in nature. I kind of see it like this. I tend to think that self that is discussed in IFS is kind of the eco-self. It's the self that's in nature and we just connect with it. I think we naturally connect with it. So when we're in nature, we can access more self-energy. Tends to be the way I see some of this. It's, I also don't see it as, I'm not seeing this as an exploitation of nature for our own healing. I'm mindful of that too. It's more this mutual connection, because what also tends to happen, interestingly enough, in the book No Bad Parts that Richard Schwartz wrote more recently about IFS, he talks about how when people work with their parts and gain more kind of integration of their parts, they naturally become more concerned about nature and have more desire to do something, which I thought was really interesting. They feel more connected to nature. So there's something here around self-energy in IFS and self-energy in nature. So doing IFS in nature, I think can be, and it can enhance the process of connecting with our parts. I also think that, well, we know that working in nature for trauma, there's incredible research around this, that there is this calming effect and an openness, a feeling of safety in nature. I know this can be impacted by what we're seeing right now, but for most people, even I do EMDR as well, and whenever I ask people about their calm, safe place, it's almost always in nature. I don't think I've ever had anyone that hasn't had a calm, safe place in nature in their mind. As does being with animals, again, in a non-exploitive way. I'm also really mindful about just using animals as, for us to feel better. But this mutually, I think, enriching and calming effect on self. I also think animals have parts and self-energy, but that's another thing. There's also part of the unburdening process, which when we unburden our parts, often we'll offer the client, where do you want to, for the part that's unburdening, where do you want to release your burden? Is it into one of the four elements, to the air, to the water, to the earth, right? To the fire. And I've had clients talk about, they have gone out to a river and released their burden into the river and watched it, right, flow away. And that, so when we do it in the office, it's one thing to describe, yes, I can envision my burden going into the river or the ocean or whatever. but to actually go to a place in nature and, you know, enact that release of the burden, I think can be extra powerful. And then just the last thing I think too is parts mapping can be externalized in really beautiful ways. So I've worked with people that see their parts as animals, um, or they could be plants, or they could be different elements, rocks, things like that. So even in nature, there would be there's these beautiful ways to say, if I start to think, I might ask a client, like, if this part were an animal, what would it be? Right? Or if this part were a plant, what would it be? And they will often right away be like, oh yeah, it's this. And so it's helpful in that sense too, to kind of connect with the different elements or different aspects of the natural world as a way of externalizing our parts. And I guess just finally, I think in my experience and with what I'm starting to see with some of the people I've been working with for a while, the clarity and the connection that comes with self energy, those C's, has helped me, for example, come back from a burnout from activism to start to get more clarity about, this is where I want to go. Like, this is where I think I can contribute to this in a way that's meaningful for me and that I won't burn me out. Climate cafes being one of them. That is sort of, for me, that's one way that I really love bringing this for people. And I feel like it is a form of activism. So, but I'm seeing this with people I've worked with that have also done activism for years and came in feeling burnt out and discouraged. And now are coming back to, I have more of a sense of, this is where I want to go now. This is where I want to, use this energy. So those are some thoughts. I'm still working on kind of where this is going, but those are my thoughts so far. And I got through it, and I think we still have time. I think I worked out the time okay. And
Great
yes, No
job,
Bad
Natalie.
Parts is great. Great book. No Bad Parts is awesome. I also, and I'm happy to share, I'll leave this up here for a minute too, but these resources I thought might be helpful as well for people. So in terms of, there's IFSCA and IFS Connect is it more recent, but these are Canadian sources of IFS information. And they're starting the formal IFS trainings in Canada only trainings now, which is kind of exciting. They're starting actually in May. So they are slowly, it's been hard to get into IFS trainings, and I also appreciate that. But they are starting to bring them to Canada only, which is very exciting. So I'll leave it there. Thank you. I love that.
Thank you, Natalie. That was wonderful. What a great overview and a blending of many different themes and concepts together. Wonderful. If you'd like to stop sharing your screen, we can see who's here and who'd like to have a question or a comment.
Scroll down. Thanks.
Sebastiana?
Yeah, I've got a question. Hi, everyone. Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm also IFS therapist and ecotherapist, and I'm really interested in bringing those two things together. So that's been really helpful. And yeah, what I'm specifically interested in, what's coming to mind is how would we bring IFS into a climate conversation or cafe? Whether you might have any tips or ideas, what has worked for you?
Yeah. I'm couple of things that come into my mind. So you mentioned the climate cafe, right? So what I've noticed is when I host climate cafes, I find that I just fall into doing IFS a little bit. So a lot of people can have the polarized parts, and I find that comes out in climate cafes. So one part that says one thing and one that says the opposite. You get the pull, right? Polarized. I'm both hopeful and in despair at the same time. And so that can be a way of just noticing, or like gently saying, oh, I noticed that sounds like there's a part of you that holds despair and a part that holds, hope or something like that. And kind of naming parts.
Mm.
And also, I'm starting to think that there could be a place for IFS themed climate cafes. For people that have even a little bit of interest or experience of saying, and what would that be? I think it just being in connection with each other is one of the ways to generate more self-energy. So I think in climate cafes, that's, I often ask at the end of the cafe, is there one word you can share to describe what you've noticed or what you're harvesting from the cafe? And so often it's something about not feeling so alone, feeling less isolated, feeling more connected. And so I'm thinking that's self-energy. It manages, even in our despair and our sadness and anger and those feelings, there's this, by being connected in what we're feeling, I think can be so powerful. So I think maybe even just, again, like naming those things might be enough to bring IFS into those
Mhm.
practices. Mhm.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank
Mm.
you. Right.
Sorry, can I get a question in here from the chat?
Yeah.
Simon's asking, do you have recommendations to facilitate generational or family dialogue in relation to climate distress and emotions?
And that is a good question. I can't help but think of my own family and get a bit of a giggle because of the differences, right? I mean, looking at my parents all the way down to my nieces and nephews, I think so from an IFS perspective, one way of approaching conflict is, interestingly enough, there's a couples approach, right, in IFS. And what you do is you use what's called the U-turn. So you hear what someone is saying in the family, and and so I might have a part that immediately gets defensive and is like, oh my gosh, like how can they think this and they don't know anything about it, or frustrated or whatever. And so the U-turn is noticing, so this part just came up in me that feels really frustrated or defensive. And can I spend a minute with it and ask it if it's willing to kind of sit back and then respond without coming from, so I'm unblending a little bit before I respond. So there might be a little bit of that, of kind of with intergenerational, like listening and appreciating that it doesn't excuse the parts, but also noticing, like, I know my parents have parts that are directly related to their own experience. And also, I think important to say, in IFS, there's legacy burdens or ancestral burdens that people can carry. So, think of people who have experienced intergenerational trauma, or different things like that, that can come into play very much, right? So people might have parts that are activated by climate distress. So having a conversation is really more than about like just really listening and paying attention to like, oh, right, I think what I hear you saying is this, and this, rather than, oh my gosh, how could you think that? So it's a little bit of bringing that. It's not going to be perfect. It isn't in my family, that's for sure. But I think it gives me more of a, okay, I can see better where this is coming from, and then I don't feel so reactive. So that might be helpful. I'm not sure how much that helps, Simon, but that's one kind of the thoughts that come up in my mind. Really good question though.
There's another question from the chat from Rosie. How do you move clients from answering what's present for them on the emotions wheel to recognizing their protective part with curiosity?
Yeah. So if we're doing so often wheel, the climate wheel, emotions wheel, or parts mapping is helpful if people have a whole bunch of different emotions and parts that come up at once. Then it's sort of like, okay, let's, can we slow down for a minute? Or you might know the usual way in for IFS is, I might ask someone, it sounds like I'm hearing you express a lot of anxiety about the weather right now. Is that right? Right. And if they're like, yeah, I think it is. And then we invite, would you like to, spend some time with this part of you that feels that anxiety? If yes, great. If no, then you don't push it, right? But if yes, then it can be helpful. Then it can be helpful to say, where do you notice this in or around your body? Right. So we're easing again gently into the part. So we're kind of, if a person has a part that's really present and they're like, this emotion feels the strongest for me, then we slowly ease into like the 6 Fs, right? Of trying to get to know the part with permission. If we don't, then it might be helpful to kind of slow down and then say, oh, maybe we should look at some of the different parts that are coming up right now and map them a little bit and just be curious and see if one comes forward and seems to want more attention than the others. So that's where I would say you're just, again, gently like finding your way in. And thank you, Michelle. I'm just going to click on your link because I want to see this. Ooh, thank you. That's amazing. I'm going to look at that more carefully. Thank you so much for sharing that, Michelle. That's great. That's exciting. But yeah, hopefully that answers that question a little bit too. I think that, I will add, and I've had to work on this, that a lot of people, understandably, if you come in to see a therapist and you're like, I have this anxiety and like, I need this gone, like I need, and there's this urgency, IFS can feel painfully slow sometimes because one way we think about this is parts have agendas. Like I want this to be gone. I need this to be fixed. I don't want to feel this anymore, etc. Self energy doesn't have any agenda. It just has this intention to heal. So there's a slower kind of movement to it where it's one of my favorite teachers said, the slower the faster, and I've never forgotten that in IFS. The slower the faster, when I was in training, and I was like, oh man, I will never forget that. Because I have to check in too, because sometimes I have parts that are like, I don't want you to feel that anymore. I need to, alleviate this. And it's like, okay, let's settle that part down for me and then come to it. Anyway, Michelle, I know you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I might form a question later, but I really appreciate what you're talking about. Something that I'm going to be diving into a little bit this year is around environmental identity and how that was formed and how it's related to how we show up in this. So I feel like as you were talking, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so connected. I don't know how, but I could feel like so all I'm saying is thank you, and I need to process how what you're doing fits into some of the stuff that I've been thinking about. So I really, really appreciate you bringing all this to the table.
That sounds really neat. I would love to know more. I would love to know more about that. So yeah, definitely. If you have my name, you can find me. But I'd love to know more about that. That sounds really cool. Thank you. Karen.
Hi, I want to add my, hold on. I want to add my thanks for you doing this. I'm IFS trained, and so a lot of what you're sharing really resonates at a really deep level, and I appreciate your deep knowledge of IFS and how we can use it in EcoPsych. Earlier you said in nature, accessing self-energy is increased, and what came to me, and it came to me again when you said that parts have an agenda, is this idea of nature always kind of being in self, right? So when we are in nature without nature having any agenda, right? That it's easier for us to access our own self energy. And I just wanted to share that because it struck me as a little bit profound, and I just wanted to offer it. Thank you.
Thank you. I love that. I didn't actually think of it that way. That's a really cool way of thinking about it. Yeah, because there just is no agenda. Right. Thank you. Yeah. It is profound. That's great. Yeah.
Natalie, I have just maybe a commentary and a bit of a question. But just to your point about going slow, I often say that to people for sure, that often you have to go slow to go fast. And I know a teacher of mine talks about glacial speed, being a thing in
Yeah.
our work with people for sure. But I think that my question is a bit around my sense of folks who have maybe experienced a fair amount of developmental trauma in their lives, actually having quite a strong ecological self somewhere back there. I think, Jerome Bernstein talked about that with sort of his borderland consciousness. But of course, their challenge is, I think, often in unblending from some of their really protective parts to access the calm that can be in service to all of it. So I don't know if you have any thoughts to offer on that in general, or even what some of the things that you might do to help some of those folks recognize their self. And I just want to say too, I do love that you brought up this notion, that this linking between self and ecological self. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And so I've noticed that a lot of work with people that have come in for climate aware therapy, it has shifted right over to childhood, healing from childhood wounds. So, and one thing that I noticed, even for myself, so partly I link that to a bit of the feeling of powerlessness. There's a familiarity with our parts if we've experienced childhood wounds, of powerlessness and vulnerability, helplessness. And also, I've noticed too, there's often a connection to animals. And I started to wonder if, because animals are vulnerable to humans, and to abuse and things like that. So I often notice in people with those kinds of wounds, that they're either connected to animals or to nature in a particular kind of way. And it seems like it just resonates with their parts, like they recognize what that feels like. So I really appreciate that, because I think there is really something there. And that often nature, so a lot of people that I talked to, nature was a refuge from those, situations, circumstances. Yes, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, woods and kittens is where I could escape. And I just hear that a lot. It was to a natural space, or it was with an animal, right? Or connecting. There was always an animal that they would connect to, that became like a very safe, trusting companion. So yeah, I think there's a lot to that. And I see it a lot. So I think a lot of the work, that's why for me, it's important to keep recognizing, like, it really needs to be really trauma sensitive and trauma informed. That's part of the slowness, recognizing that a lot of the parts that come forward are protecting these deeply vulnerable parts. So what we see are these protective parts that might be really high functioning managers or more dramatic firefighters, but there's always that deep vulnerability behind them. So being aware of that can change, I think. For me, it has softened my response sometimes to people that are, that come forward really aggressively, and I have to, like, okay, those are their protective parts coming forward first. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you. And I think that I just
Mhm.
I was wanting to go back to a question in the chat. I think a couple of people have asked about having access to your slides or your presentation, so I don't know how you feel about that or how.
Yeah, I don't know what if you do anything normally, Carol, with that or,
Yeah, well, everyone who registered will get the replay link, which will include all your slides in the video. So
okay.
yeah, I think that covers it all. And I'm just going to stop the recording right now. Thank you.